Hi, I'm Silver Pen, and welcome to the fourth episode of Silver Tales, a series where I read my original short stories written, voiced, and created by me. These stories are my original work, so please do not repost them, claim them, try and profit, as I pour a lot of heart into these stories and a lot of work into these videos. So we're getting into spooky season, and so I am starting off with a lovely ghost story at a lighthouse. So let's strap in for some good old-fashioned psychological drama. The Lighthouse. Ephraim adjusted the woolen coat over his stump, the wooden leg clinking against the deck of the boat that cut through the choppy surf. He could just see the outline of the island, if you could call it that. A pile of jagged black rocks that cut out of the sea like teeth, with a small lighthouse clinging to their surface. The lighthouse rose, tall and solemn, with its whitewashed walls mottled with salt and age. Its narrow windows were dark and abandoned. He would spend the next year in isolation, with the wind and salt and waves. The pain in his stump ached from the amputation that had ended his Navy days. He was no stranger to hardship. But even hardship, he thought, could not prepare a man for the loneliness of this place. The boat reached the dock, and the young men who brought him stepped out and tied the line. They carried boxes of food and fresh water up to the lighthouse. Ephraim felt guilty for not helping, but he was having all he could do to climb the steep path up to the front door. The wind tore at his coat and whipped his hair across his face. Ephraim finally reached the door and opened it. The base of the lighthouse was a round room. Inside was a kitchen, sitting area, and dining space. Up the stairs was the bedroom, and the outhouse was down by the shore. The men finished putting the last of their cargo into the storage shed. He shook their hands, and they promised to return in 6 months to resupply. He waved them off as their boat took them back towards civilization. Ephraim began by tidying the place to his liking, before finally beginning the first of many climbs up the stairs. The spiral was tight, the iron rail slick with moisture, each step echoing in the tower to accompany his labored breathing. Click, thunk, click, thunk. The lamp room above waited, its brass lenses dull under a layer of dust. He would have to clean it, polish it, and light the flame before the night fully claimed the horizon. Yet the air was heavier somehow. Ephraim shook his head and rubbed his eyes. The prospect of a year alone was both a blessing and a curse. A place where his thoughts could plague him without distraction, but also a place where the slowness of nature might finally grant him peace. The stump was not the only injury Ephraim carried. A scar by his own hand lay on his soul. It happened in the summer of 1752 when he was a young man barely old enough to grow his first beard hairs. They had been docked in Lisbon, 2 young sailors with too much rum and too little sense. The argument started over a tavern girl with sharp eyes and a laugh that seemed to follow them both. Ephraim had thought he could seduce her with words, but James had a way about him that charmed both men and women. If Ephraim was honest, he'd always admired James. He had the making of a genuine leader. Even their captain thought so, often mentoring James and taking him under his wing. But with admiration can also come jealousy. That night, words escalated into shoves, then fists. The tavern erupted around them, laughter and shouting blending into the smell of ale and smoke. The very girl they were fighting over threw them out. Later on the docks, Ephraim remembered the weight of James' fist against his jaw. The taste of copper in his mouth, the world spinning. In a drunken fury, he had shoved James back. The man tripped over a barrel, staggered and stumbled toward the water. Ephraim had tried to catch him, but the wine in their veins made their limbs clumsy. James hit his head and fell. Ephraim had jumped in, swam around in the dark water calling for him, but James was gone, swallowed by the sea. Ephraim considered calling for help or admitting the accident, but he didn't. He had been drunk, angry, and then terrified. And in that moment he realized with cold clarity that he had been the cause. James had fought him over something as meaningless as pride and desire, and Ephraim sent him to his death. The water claimed him, the tide moved on, and Ephraim sailed away with a hollow weight in his chest that never left. Over the next few weeks at the lighthouse, Ephraim grew accustomed to a routine. He would wake mid-afternoon and have a simple meal. All his food was preserved, but sometimes he could catch a fish off the dock. Then as the night crept in, he would make himself a pot of coffee, collect his logbook, and carry it up the lighthouse. Up here he would polish the brass fittings of the lantern and fill the oil that kept it lit. Then he would sit for the long night, blowing the foghorn and refilling the oil when necessary. Come dawn, Ephraim would climb back down and go to bed. The wind, fog, waves, and salt in the air were ever present. Yet as time went on, he noticed something odd. A shadow that flickered at the corner of his eye. A soft, scratching sound when the wind was unusually calm. Always brief, always gone before he could be certain he'd seen or heard it. Tonight was no different. As Ephraim had climbed the stairs, he thought he heard a creak from below, but a quick look down showed nothing. He shook his head. "I've spent too many nights staring into the fog," he muttered. "Mind plays tricks when it's lonely enough." As he lit the lighthouse, he felt it again, a subtle shift in the air, like a presence pressing just beyond sight. The fire in the lamp guttered for a heartbeat, though the air was still, and for a moment he swore he saw a figure standing near the stairwell. He spun around, heart thumping, but there was nothing, only the stone walls and the endless rolling sea. A bell of a ship tolled somewhere in the distance, drawing his attention. Ephraim sat down and returned to his logbook, scratching down the evening observations. Wind northwest, visibility poor. But his eyes kept drifting to the stairwell, half expecting it to stir. And that was when he felt it, a faint pressure on the back of his neck, like someone breathing there. Ephraim froze. The wind screamed through the lantern room's open windows, and for a moment he could hear nothing else. Then, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching came from the stairs. He kept his eyes down, hand trembling as it gripped his pen. "No," he whispered. "No, it's nothing." But deep down, he knew better. Ephraim set down the pen. The room was so quiet now he could hear the blood pulsing in his ears. Then, faint as the wash of waves far below, came a whisper. "Murderer!" He spun, heart hammering. "Who's there?" he barked. Only the spiral stone answered. Had to be the wind. He forced a dry laugh, but didn't believe it. He recognized that voice even after 30 years. Candle in hand, Ephraim descended his wooden leg clunking. Click, thunk, click, thunk, all the way down the iron stairs. At the bottom, he stepped into the living space and froze. A chair had been pulled from the dining table and turned towards the stairs. The candle flickered in his hand. "James," he whispered, voice raw. Silence was worse than any answer. Ephraim climbed back up the stairs and tried to focus on his work. When the sunlight finally pressed through the windows, he convinced himself it must have been him. Perhaps he'd pulled out the chair while half asleep intending to sit, then forgot. The explanation did not sit well, but it was enough to let him rest. Days passed in his usual rhythm, though he noticed himself avoiding the chair, never sitting in it, never moving it back. The wind had a new pitch in its howl, and he swore it sounded like words, though he could never catch them. One evening while scanning the coast through his spyglass, Ephraim froze. A figure stood out on the jagged rocks at the base of the island. A young man in a sailor's uniform. Despite the wind, his hair and clothes remained perfectly still. "Impossible," Ephraim breathed. He lowered the glass and clambered down the stairs. Stumbling out into the night, his wooden legs struggled to find purchase on the rock. He half hobbled, half slid down towards the waterline. When he reached where the man had been, there was no one. Only the endless crash and hiss as the tide dragged itself back into the dark. Ephraim's chest heaved. He braced himself against the stone and scanned the cliffs, the surf, the darkness. Nothing. And yet faint beneath the sea's fury, he thought he heard bitter laughter. He staggered back to the lighthouse, drenched and shaking. When he opened the door, the chair was back at the table, tucked neatly into place. After that, the days blurred into one another, a cycle of silence and paranoia. The logbook, once filled with careful lines of notes, now had the unsteady ramblings of a madman. Ephraim ate less, slept less. When he did sleep, it was restless. He dreamed of water slapping against a coffin lid and a bloated face. The whispers grew louder, at first only at night when he was on duty, but then, in the daylight, while boiling coffee or mending his coat, he would hear the word. Murderer! Sometimes clear, other times like a breath in his ear. The shadows grew bolder, a figure at the edge of the rocks, a shape just outside the window. Once he swore he saw a man climbing the spiral stairs behind him, water dripping from his hair, and each step silent with Ephraim's own uneven gait. He covered the mirror in the outhouse and left food on the table for James. He began talking out loud during his vigils in the lamp room, muttering apologies into the fog, pleading with shadows for forgiveness. His mind no longer gave him peace. The lighthouse had become a prison of echoes, and every sound carried James's name. One evening, Ephraim caught sight of a storm coming from the north. It bore down in a torrent. Lightning split the sea and the lighthouse shook. Anyone else would seek shelter, but Ephraim had a job to do. He climbed the lighthouse, trying to shake the familiar shadows that came with him. Click, thunk, click, thunk, click, thunk. When he reached the top, Ephraim stopped in horror. A figure stood on the railing of the lighthouse, one wrong move from plunging 100 feet into the rocks and sea below. Their head turned, and Ephraim screamed. It was James's face, but it was like a skeleton with skin stretched over it. Hollow eyes that cried tears of salt water, but still managed to glare. James's foot lifted, and he stepped off into oblivion. Ephraim reacted without thinking. He lunged forward to catch him. His arms passed through empty air, and with a shout, Ephraim went over the railing and plunged out of sight. The boat came again to resupply, but Ephraim was not there to greet it. They found his absence, a logbook with pages ending abruptly, and a light extinguished long before its oil was spent. The sea had claimed him, the men said, as it claims so many. They did not linger or wonder how. By midsummer, a new lightkeeper arrived. Thomas had wiry, sun-browned skin and a grin that rarely left his face. He leapt from the boat to the dock with the ease of youth, hauling his own trunk up the jagged path. "A year by the sea!" he laughed, his voice carrying up the cliffs. "I'll be able to write my novel and have enough money to marry when I return." Thomas threw open the door to the lighthouse and paused at a strange sight. Someone had pulled out a chair and left it in the middle of the room, facing the stairs. "That's odd," he said. Thomas put the chair back where it belonged at the table and got to work settling in. When at last the sun sank, Thomas climbed the spiral stairs with a lantern in hand, humming to himself. His boots rang against the iron steps. However, something seemed off. There, beneath his own steady rhythm, came another. A foot and something wooden clunking up the stairs behind him. Did one of the sailors stay to play tricks? "Hello," he called down. "Who's there?" Only silence and the faintest scent of brine answered. Then again he heard it. Click, thunk. Click, thunk. The sound was climbing. From my pen to your ears, thanks for joining me for this segment of Silver Tales. Hopefully you didn't listen to this in the dark and are now too scared. If you enjoyed this story and is interested in more, please like, comment, and subscribe. See you again soon for more stories spun in silver.